It began like something out of a troubled teenager's journal, a spiral of heartbreak, jealousy, and desperate decisions. But what unfolded in early 1992 became one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in Indiana history, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the age of those involved. At the center was 16-year-old Melinda Loveless, a girl whose path to infamy would raise questions that still haunt the juvenile justice system to this day. Melinda was born in New Albany, Indiana, in 1975. Her childhood was anything but ordinary. Court records and later interviews described her home life as unstable, marred by allegations of emotional volatility and family dysfunction. Despite this, Melinda attended school, formed friendships, and was known for her intense, often magnetic personality. She was fiercely loyal to those she cared about, and just as intense when it came to people she saw as threats. By her early teens, she had already begun to struggle with abandonment issues and emotional insecurity, particularly in relationships. When Melinda began dating another girl named Amanda Heverin, it seemed like she had found someone who understood her. But like many teenage relationships, the connection didn't last. After they broke up, Amanda formed a new friendship with a younger girl, 12-year-old Shanda Scherer. Though Melinda didn't know Shanda personally, she saw the new bond as a direct threat. That belief quickly evolved into a dangerous obsession, fueled by jealousy and emotional instability. By early January 1992, Melinda had become fixated on confronting Shanda. She recruited a group of acquaintances to help, all teenagers themselves, some barely older than Shanda. While some of them later claimed they thought the plan was only to scare or intimidate the younger girl, Melinda had brought a knife, and the intensity of her anger suggested far worse. What began as a confrontation quickly spiraled into something unimaginably darker. The group lured Shanda out of her father's house late one night under false pretenses. At first, no one knew exactly how far things would go. But as the hours passed, it became disturbingly clear that this was no teenage prank or scare tactic. The situation escalated into one of the most shocking acts of violence the state had ever seen. The following morning, authorities were called to a remote area in southern Indiana, where they discovered a horrific crime scene that launched a statewide manhunt. While we're omitting graphic details out of respect for viewers and Shanda's family, the brutality of what occurred left law enforcement, the media, and the entire community in disbelief. The fact that a group of teenage girls had orchestrated such a crime made the case even more haunting. Investigators quickly identified Melinda Loveless as the central figure. According to law enforcement testimony, she appeared emotionally detached during questioning, even calm. Some reported she seemed more fixated on her relationship with Amanda than the severity of the situation. Alongside Melinda, 3 other girls were arrested: Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. All were charged as adults due to the violent nature of the crime. Melinda was ultimately charged with murder and criminal confinement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witness accounts, she accepted a plea agreement in 1993 and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. She was 17 years old at the time. Lori Tackett received the same sentence. Hope Rippey's sentence was reduced on appeal, and she was released in 2006. Toni Lawrence, who had a lesser role and cooperated early, was sentenced to 20 years and released in 2000. During her incarceration, Melinda's life took unexpected turns. She participated in mental health programs, earned educational credits, and became involved in a rehabilitation initiative training service dogs for people with disabilities. Those who met her later described a quieter, more reflective individual. Yet, for many, the question remained: could any amount of remorse or rehabilitation ever fully reconcile with what had happened? The case became a lightning rod in debates over juvenile sentencing. Advocates for criminal justice reform pointed to Melinda's story as a stark example of why emotional and psychological development must be factored into sentencing young offenders. Critics argued that the level of violence in the crime demanded adult consequences, regardless of age. These debates only intensified as the U.S. Supreme Court began to impose limits on life sentences without parole for minors. After serving more than 27 years behind bars, Melinda Loveless was released from the Indiana Women's Prison in September 2019. Her release reignited public discussion. Some believed she had served her time and earned a chance to rebuild her life. Others felt the punishment could never truly match the pain caused. For the family of Shonda Scherer, the loss is permanent. Yet in a move that surprised many, Shonda's mother, Jacqueline Vaught, publicly expressed forgiveness. Over the years, she became a quiet but firm advocate for restorative justice and prison reform, choosing grace over vengeance. Today, Melinda Loveless remains a controversial figure. Some see her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked teenage emotion. Others point to her years of rehabilitation as proof that change is possible, even after terrible decisions. But no matter where one stands, her case remains one of the most emotionally complex and legally significant in Indiana's history. In the end, the Loveless case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of a child's crime is shaped by their environment and mental health? At what point does accountability outweigh the potential for rehabilitation? And how should justice respond when youth, trauma, and irreversible harm collide in a single courtroom? In February 2004, the halls of Southwood Middle School in Palmetto Bay, Florida, were just like any other, buzzing with students, last-minute homework, and the usual teenage chatter. But by the end of that day, one student would be gone, another would be in police custody, and a community would be left reeling. The case shocked parents, teachers, and investigators, not just because of the violence involved, but because of who carried it out. His name was Michael Hernandez. He was just 14 years old. Michael wasn't the kind of student anyone expected this from. He was well-spoken, neatly dressed, and came from a stable home. Teachers described him as quiet and intelligent, and he had never been in serious trouble at school. He blended in, not a troublemaker, not particularly popular, just an average kid. But behind that exterior, something dark had been developing. Michael had started to immerse himself in violent ideologies. He began writing in journals about power, control, and what it would feel like to kill. Eventually, he put together a list, a handwritten plan of students he intended to murder, complete with specific names and steps. At the top of that list was Jaime Goff, one of his closest friends. Jaime was 14 too, friendly, soft-spoken, and well-liked by classmates. He had known Michael since childhood. They'd grown up together, gone to birthday parties, sat in class side by side. So when Michael invited Jaime to meet him in a school bathroom early that morning before class, Jaime didn't hesitate. What happened next would horrify everyone who later learned the details. During that brief encounter, Michael attacked his friend. He had brought a knife from home, concealed in his backpack. When Jaime didn't return to class, a staff member checked the restroom and discovered the scene. Police were called immediately. Michael was located soon after and taken in for questioning. Incredibly, he confessed, not just to the act itself, but to everything behind it. He told detectives that he had been planning the murder for weeks, that he had researched serial killers online, and that this was only the beginning. He named more students he had planned to target and even admitted he had tried to lure a second boy into the same bathroom just hours later. This was no impulsive act. It was planned, calculated, and chillingly emotionless. Michael described his actions in clinical terms. He showed little remorse, and for detectives, that lack of emotion was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. He had orchestrated a premeditated killing, not in a fit of rage, but out of what he called curiosity. Because of the severity of the crime, Michael was charged as an adult. The decision sparked immediate public debate. Should a 14-year-old be tried in the same way as a grown man? What role did mental health play? And was this a child who could ever be rehabilitated? At trial, Michael's defense team pointed to his age and his underlying mental health issues. He had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and traits consistent with early antisocial behavior. But the prosecution argued that Michael was fully aware of his actions and that the level of planning made him legally responsible. They presented his journals, his confession, and the disturbing details of the kill list as evidence of deliberate intent. In 2008, after a lengthy trial and failed appeals, Michael Hernandez was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Guff family, the verdict brought some closure, but not healing. Their son had been taken from them in the most senseless way imaginable, by someone he had trusted. They would later speak out about the importance of early warning signs and how schools and families must take threats, even subtle ones, more seriously. Michael remained incarcerated in Florida for over a decade. During his time in prison, he showed little indication of change. He gave a few interviews, but never expressed meaningful remorse. Prison staff noted that he was often isolated and emotionally detached. For many, the case faded into memory, just another tragic example of youth violence in America. Then, in April 2021, news broke that Michael Hernandez had died in prison. He collapsed in the shower and was later pronounced dead at age 31. The cause was listed as a sudden cardiac event with no signs of foul play. His death brought the case back into the headlines, if only briefly, and reignited conversations about teenage offenders, life sentences, and the lasting impact of adolescent crime. Today, the story of Michael Hernandez remains one of the most disturbing juvenile crime cases in U.S. history. It's often studied in legal and psychological circles, not because of the brutality involved, but because of what it revealed about motive, and how a child with no history of abuse or trauma could still choose to commit something so violent. Jaime Goff is remembered by classmates and his community as kind, smart, and full of potential. His life, tragically cut short, is the real center of this story, not the actions of the person who took it. His parents have spent years advocating for awareness, hoping that what happened to their son might help prevent another family from experiencing the same grief. The case of Michael Hernandez forces difficult questions. What drives a teenager to kill a friend? Can psychological issues truly explain it? And how does a community begin to heal after a tragedy born not from impulse, but from planning? Sometimes the most tragic acts of violence don't happen in the streets. They unfold inside the very places we trust to keep children safe. In 2008, a middle school in Oxnard, California, became the scene of a crime that would spark national outrage and ignite a difficult conversation about identity, bullying, and accountability. The case of 14-year-old Brandon McInerney and his classmate Larry King wasn't just another school shooting. It was a crime fueled by deep social tensions, and it forced the public to confront questions that remain difficult even today. Brandon McInerney was in the 8th grade at E.O. Green Junior High School. He was just 14 years old, a white student from a working-class family with a troubled home life. Reports later revealed that Brandon had been exposed to violence and instability growing up. His father had a history of domestic abuse, and both parents struggled with substance-related issues. Despite this, Brandon was considered intelligent and capable in school. But underneath the surface, he was also angry. And that anger would soon find a target. That target was Larry King. Larry was just 15 years old, also an 8th grader at the same school. He had been in the foster care system, bounced between homes, and struggled with acceptance. But despite his challenges, Larry had recently started to express himself more openly, wearing makeup, high heels, and clothing that reflected his identity as a gay or gender non-conforming teen. Some classmates supported him, others didn't. But among those who took issue with Larry's self-expression was Brandon McInerney. According to multiple witnesses, Brandon had become increasingly frustrated by Larry's behavior. Specifically, there were reports that Larry had made flirtatious comments toward Brandon, possibly in front of others. Whether those comments were meant playfully, confidently, or even defiantly, They seemed to provoke Brandon. Some classmates claimed that Larry had told Brandon he liked him. Others suggested that Brandon felt humiliated in front of peers. Whatever the truth, Brandon didn't respond by telling a teacher, changing seats, or asking for help. Instead, he made a plan. On the morning of February 12, 2008, Brandon brought a handgun to school. He had taken it from his home, where firearms were accessible despite his age. He concealed the weapon in his backpack and waited through the morning. In the middle of a computer lab class, with students and a teacher present, Brandon stood up, walked behind Larry King, and shot him once in the back of the head. Then he fired a second time. The entire classroom erupted into chaos. Larry King was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was irreversible. He was declared brain dead the next day. His organs were donated, and his death left a permanent scar on the students and staff who witnessed what happened. Brandon McInerney fled the classroom, but was caught by police shortly after near the school. He admitted to the shooting without much resistance. Because of the seriousness of the crime, prosecutors made the controversial decision to charge Brandon as an adult, despite the fact that he was only 14. The charges included first-degree murder and a hate crime enhancement. This decision drew national attention and ignited a fierce debate. On one hand, some believed that Brandon understood exactly what he was doing, that the attack was premeditated, and that the hate crime designation was appropriate. On the other hand, advocates argued that Brandon was still a child, raised in a toxic environment, influenced by violence and extremist ideas, and that trying him as an adult ignored his potential for rehabilitation. The legal process was long and emotionally charged. During the first trial in 2011, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision. The case ended in a mistrial. The district attorney initially planned to retry him on the same charges, but in a plea agreement later that year, Brandon McInerney admitted guilt to second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and use of a firearm. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Because he was a minor at the time, he would not be eligible for parole until after serving a large portion of that sentence. The fallout from the case was widespread. Larry King's murder became a symbol of the dangers faced by LGBTQ youth, especially those who express their identity openly in hostile environments. Schools around the country re-examined their anti-bullying policies and their handling of gender identity issues. Advocacy groups pushed for more inclusive education and safer school environments. At the same time, Brandon's supporters questioned whether the system had failed him too, pointing to his unstable upbringing, his exposure to violence, and the decision to try him as an adult. In interviews given after his sentencing, Brandon expressed regret for what he had done. He admitted that the shooting was planned and that he had been angry, but he also seemed to struggle with understanding the full consequences of his actions. His words, while somber, could never undo the loss. Today, Brandon McInerney remains incarcerated in California. He is expected to be released in his 30s. His case continues to be studied by legal scholars, educators, and advocates as a tragic example of what can happen when warning signs are missed, when conflict escalates unchecked, and when the lines between adolescence and accountability become blurred. For the family of Larry King, the pain never went away. They lost a child, someone they described as bright, artistic, and courageous. And while the case may no longer make headlines, it still echoes in classrooms, in legal debates, and in the ongoing fight to ensure that no student is ever made to feel unsafe simply for being themselves. The final day of school is supposed to be a celebration, a time for students to look forward to summer break, reflect on the year behind them, and say goodbye to their teachers and classmates. But in Lake Worth, Florida, the end of the school year in 2000 became something else entirely. That day would leave a community shaken and launch a national conversation about juvenile justice, all because of one boy, just 13 years old, named Nathaniel Brazill. At first glance, Nathaniel seemed like a typical middle school student. He was bright, well-liked by many teachers, and didn't have a significant disciplinary record. He played in the school band, got decent grades, and had a shy, polite demeanor that didn't raise alarm. But like many kids his age, Nathaniel was navigating a complex emotional world, one filled with shifting friendships, peer pressure, and the growing weight of adolescence. Underneath the surface, he was struggling with family instability, frustration, and emotional confusion that he hadn't fully expressed to anyone. On May 26, 2000, the last day of school at Lake Worth Middle School, Nathaniel was involved in a small incident. He had been seen throwing water balloons, something most would consider a harmless prank. But when he was sent to the office for his behavior, things escalated quickly. Nathaniel became upset, and after a brief disciplinary review, he was suspended and sent home for the day. By itself, that might have been the end of it. But what followed would turn that school into the focus of national media coverage. After leaving campus, Nathaniel didn't stay home. Instead, he rode his bike to a friend's house. There, he found a handgun, one that belonged to the friend's father and had reportedly been left in an unsecured location. Nathaniel took the weapon and later returned to the school campus. According to witnesses, he appeared calm, even composed. He walked into the building and sought out one specific person, his English teacher, Barry Grunow. Mr. Grunow was known as a dedicated and caring educator. He had a good relationship with students, including Nathaniel. There were no signs of conflict between them, and no one could later recall a single argument or issue. That's what made what happened next so baffling. Nathaniel reportedly asked to speak with him. Then, without warning, he pulled out the weapon and fired a single shot. Mr. Grunow died shortly after. The entire encounter lasted just moments, but the impact would ripple for decades. Students and staff were left in shock. The image of a 13-year-old committing such a fatal act at school was almost too much to process. Law enforcement arrived quickly, and Nathaniel was taken into custody without resistance. He reportedly cooperated with investigators, showed signs of remorse, and seemed to struggle with understanding the full consequences of what he had done. But despite his age, the legal system had a difficult decision to make. Because of the seriousness of the crime, prosecutors charged Nathaniel Brazill as an adult. The public response was sharply divided. Some believed the charge was necessary due to the nature of the act. Others argued that a 13-year-old simply couldn't be held to the same standard of accountability as an adult. As the case moved toward trial, these questions took center stage. How do we balance justice with rehabilitation? And how young is too young for a life-altering sentence? During the trial, the prosecution argued that the act was intentional. They presented evidence of Nathaniel's decision-making, the acquisition of the weapon, and his calm demeanor during the incident. The defense, meanwhile, highlighted his age, lack of criminal history, and emotional immaturity. They suggested that Nathaniel hadn't fully grasped the reality of what he was doing, that it was a moment of confusion and impulse, not cold calculation. In 2001, Nathaniel Brazill was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. He was also given an additional 7 years for aggravated assault for pointing the gun at another teacher during the incident, with the sentences to run concurrently. The verdict drew national attention. Critics questioned whether such a lengthy sentence was appropriate for someone so young. Supporters of the ruling pointed to the irreversible consequences of his actions, especially for Mr. Grunow's family, who had lost a husband, father, and beloved teacher. Throughout his time in prison, Nathaniel has taken steps toward rehabilitation. He's earned a high school diploma, completed vocational training, and participated in counseling programs. In later interviews, he has expressed remorse for what happened and talked about the moment as a turning point in his life. But for many, especially those who knew Barry Grunow, the pain of that day hasn't faded. His students remember him as kind, supportive, and always willing to help. His family continues to honor his memory through charitable efforts and educational advocacy. The case of Nathaniel Brazill became one of the most significant juvenile crime cases in Florida's modern history. It sparked changes in school safety protocols, gun storage laws, and ongoing debates about how the justice system should handle youth offenders. It also underscored how fragile the line can be between adolescence and adult responsibility. As of now, Nathaniel remains incarcerated. He is scheduled to be released in 2028 when he will be in his early 40s. Having spent more than 2 decades behind bars for a decision he made as a young teenager. Whether the time served reflects justice or tragedy depends on who you ask. But no matter how one sees it, the case stands as a sobering reminder that even the youngest among us are capable of life-altering choices, and that every system, from schools to courts, must constantly evaluate how to respond with both accountability and compassion. At first glance, it seemed like something out of a psychological thriller, a pair of identical twins, torn apart by jealousy, resentment, and years of emotional distance. But for investigators in California during the late 1990s, the story of Jeena Han wasn't fiction. It was all too real. She had once shared everything with her twin sister Sunny, a birthday, a home, even a face. But by her early 20s, Jeena had become known by a chilling nickname, the Evil Twin. It was a name that would follow her for decades, and it all began with a crime that had been years in the making. Jeena and Sunny Han were born in South Korea and raised in California. Growing up, they were inseparable, 2 halves of the same whole, as their parents described it. But as the girls entered adolescence, things began to shift. Jeena was more rebellious, more impulsive. Sunny, by contrast, was structured, academic, and cautious. As the differences grew, so did the emotional distance between them. What had once been a close bond slowly became fractured, marked by jealousy and competition. By the time they were both in their late teens, the sisters were no longer speaking. While Sunny thrived in school and pursued a career in law, Jeena struggled. She had legal issues, struggled with finances, and frequently clashed with authority. Despite these setbacks, Jeena remained fixated on her sister's life. Court documents and later testimony revealed that she felt Sunny had taken everything, including the approval of their family. That resentment simmered for years, gradually morphing into something far more dangerous. By 1996, Jeena was 22 years old. Though legally an adult, prosecutors would later argue that the roots of her plan had been planted during her teenage years. A period filled with emotional instability, untreated psychological issues, and years of internalized anger. Instead of seeking reconciliation, Jeena began crafting a plan, one that would shock not only her family, but the nation. Jeena recruited 2 teenage boys, both younger than 17, to help her carry out her idea. The plan, according to court records, was chillingly detailed. They would break into Sunny's apartment, tie her up, and eventually kill her. One of the teens was promised money. The other was reportedly manipulated into believing Jeena's story that Sunny had somehow wronged her. But what neither of them fully realized was how far Jeena was willing to go to see the plan through. On the evening of November 6, 1996, Sunny returned to her apartment in Irvine, California. Inside, she was met by the 2 teenage boys, one of whom was armed. She was tied up and held hostage in her own home, unaware that the person behind the plot was her own twin sister. But something unexpected happened. One of the teens got cold feet. Whether it was fear, guilt, or simply the realization of what they were about to do, he decided to act. He contacted the police, anonymously tipping them off to what was unfolding in the apartment. Law enforcement responded quickly. They arrived at Sunny's apartment and discovered her bound but physically unharmed. The teens were arrested at the scene. Soon after, Jeena Han was identified as the mastermind. When she was brought into custody, she reportedly showed little emotion. Investigators were stunned by the level of detail in her planning. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was something that had taken root over time, fueled by years of obsession and unresolved emotions. In court, Jeena was charged with multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit murder, burglary, and false imprisonment. Her defense team acknowledged her emotional instability, but argued that she never intended to go through with the plan. Prosecutors disagreed, presenting text messages, phone records, and testimony from the teens to show how deliberate the plot really was. The trial drew intense media coverage, largely because of the unusual dynamic, a twin plotting to kill her identical sister. It was the kind of case that blurred the line between emotional trauma and criminal intent. Ultimately, the jury was convinced by the prosecution's case. In 1998, Jeena Han was convicted and sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. She was sent to the California Institution for Women, where she began serving a sentence that could have kept her behind bars for the rest of her life. Her twin sister Sunny, though physically unharmed, carried the emotional scars from the betrayal. In interviews years later, she spoke about the pain of knowing that someone she once loved and trusted had wanted her gone. For years, Jeena remained in prison with little public attention. But in 2018, something unexpected happened. Sunny, the same sister who had once been the target of Jeena's plan, appeared at her parole hearing and advocated for her release. She told the parole board that she had forgiven her sister and believed Jeena had changed. The board agreed, citing Jeena's participation in mental health treatment and rehabilitation programs. Jeena Han was granted parole and released in late 2019 after serving more than 23 years. Her release reignited debate around forgiveness, mental illness, and second chances. Some saw her release as a testament to the human capacity for change. Others questioned whether someone who had orchestrated such a calculated plan should ever walk free. Today, the story of Jeena Han remains one of the most unique and emotionally complex cases in California's criminal history. It's not just a story about crime, it's a story about identity, family, and the consequences of unresolved pain. For true crime scholars and casual observers alike, it continues to raise difficult questions. How much can family history influence criminal behavior? Can years of psychological pressure be considered in the eyes of the law? And perhaps most importantly, can the deepest betrayals ever truly be forgiven? When the word murder is associated with a 12-year-old, it immediately challenges everything we think we know about childhood. At that age, most kids are navigating middle school, learning who they are, and spending their afternoons doing homework or playing games. But in Moses Lake, Washington, one tragic story in 2003 proved that even the youngest individuals are capable of actions that can alter lives forever. The name at the center of that case was Jake Eakin, a boy whose life would take two drastically different paths, one that led him into the justice system and one that later made him an unexpected voice within it. At just 12 years old, Jake Eakin wasn't what most people would consider dangerous. He was quiet, small for his age, and often stayed under the radar. He had a group of friends, including a 13-year-old boy named Evan Savoy, and another child, a mutual acquaintance named Craig Sorger. Craig, who was also 13, had autism and developmental delays. He was trusting, friendly, and looked up to the other boys. On February 15, 2003, the three boys went out together to play in a local park, something they had done many times before, but this time, something went horribly wrong. Later that afternoon, Craig was found dead in the woods, not far from the play area. The crime scene immediately shocked law enforcement, not just because of the victim's age, but because of the brutality involved. It was one of the most severe and baffling crimes the small community had ever seen. In the hours and days that followed, suspicion quickly turned to the only two people known to have been with Craig that day, Jake and Evan. At first, both boys denied involvement. Their stories changed over time. Eventually, Jake confessed to witnessing the crime, but claimed he didn't take part in the most violent aspects of it. He stated that Evan was the main aggressor, and that he felt scared, overwhelmed, and unable to stop what was happening. Despite his age, Jake was arrested and charged. Because of the nature of the crime, the state of Washington allowed prosecutors to try both boys as adults. This decision sparked immediate controversy. Was a 12-year-old emotionally or cognitively capable of understanding the full consequences of such a decision? Could a child that age truly comprehend the weight of an adult criminal sentence? Or did the severity of the crime override those questions? Jake ultimately reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, acknowledging that while he may not have been the primary attacker, he had been involved and had not stopped the crime or reported it immediately. In exchange, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. His co-defendant, Evan Savoy, went to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder. He received a sentence of 26 years. For Jake, prison began at an age when most kids are just entering their teenage years. He was held in juvenile facilities until he turned 18, then transferred to an adult prison. Those early years were marked by confusion, isolation, and a growing awareness of the gravity of what he had been part of. Unlike many others in his position, Jake didn't shut down. He began asking questions, not just about what had happened, but about how kids like him could make choices that led to such devastating outcomes. While serving his sentence, Jake earned a high school diploma and participated in rehabilitative programs. More importantly, he began speaking publicly, not for himself, but to raise awareness about the juvenile justice system. He came to believe that children should not be treated the same as adults in the courtroom, even in the most severe cases. His reflections weren't about minimizing the harm caused, but about creating space for accountability and growth. In 2016, after serving nearly 13 years, Jake Eakin was released from prison. He was still in his mid-20s, but had already spent over half his life behind bars. Most people expected him to fade into anonymity. Instead, he chose a different path. He became a public speaker, working with organizations that advocate for criminal justice reform, especially around how minors are treated in the legal system. He's shared his story with lawmakers, students, and even correctional officers, hoping that his experience could help prevent others from going down the same road. To this day, Jake has never minimized his role in what happened. He has consistently acknowledged the loss of Craig Sorger, expressing deep remorse for the life that was taken and the pain caused to the Sorger family. He does not seek to erase his past, but rather to use it as a warning and a lesson. His advocacy is grounded not in redemption, but in responsibility, a rare approach for someone who entered the justice system before they had even become a teenager. The case of Jake Eakin remains one of Washington State's most controversial examples of juvenile prosecution. It's been used in academic studies, legislative hearings, and criminal justice reform movements as a case study on how young is too young to be tried as an adult. For every person who supports the original sentence, there are others who argue that such a young offender could have, and should have, been treated within the juvenile system from the start. Today, Jake continues to speak publicly and share his story, not to gain sympathy, but to spark difficult conversations. His case raises the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers. How much can a 12-year-old truly understand about life and death? What role does fear play in moments of silence or inaction? And how should society respond when the person who committed a serious crime is still just a child? For all its legal and moral complexity, the story of Jake Eakin is ultimately a reminder of how early choices, even those made in fear or confusion, can echo for a lifetime. It's also a story of what can happen when that echo is transformed into something more: a voice, a mission, and a chance to make meaning out of tragedy. In the spring of 1985, a crime in Gary, Indiana, would set off a wave of outrage, heartbreak, and eventually, a worldwide movement. At the center of it was a 15-year-old girl named Paula Cooper, a troubled teenager whose actions would land her on death row, spark international protests, and leave a permanent mark on America's juvenile justice system. Paula Cooper didn't grow up in the safest of environments. By the time she was a teenager, she had already experienced neglect, physical abuse, and exposure to violence at home. Reports from the time described her early life as chaotic, filled with instability and moments where basic support was lacking. But still, no one expected that her name would soon become known around the world, not for being a victim, but for the crime she committed. On May 14, 1985, Paula and 3 other teenage girls skipped school and made a plan to rob someone, specifically a woman they knew from the neighborhood. That woman was 78-year-old Ruth Pelk, a retired Bible teacher who was known for her generosity and kindness. Ruth often welcomed young people into her home to share scripture, offer advice, or simply provide a safe place to talk. She had even opened her door to Paula once before. But on that afternoon, the girls came not for guidance, but for something else. Their plan was to steal money so they could buy clothes, food, and other things they felt they needed. What happened next was the turning point. Ruth was killed in her home, and the crime sent immediate shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Gary. The involvement of 4 teenage girls, and the senselessness of the act, created a storm of grief and fury that reached far beyond the city limits. Paula was quickly identified as the ringleader. She was 15 years old, just months away from turning 16. The other girls were younger. All were arrested and charged. But it was Paula's case that drew the most attention. When prosecutors reviewed the details, they decided to pursue the harshest penalty allowed under Indiana law, the death sentence. In 1986, after a brief but emotional trial, Paula Cooper was convicted and sentenced to death by electrocution. At 16 years old, she became the youngest person on death row in the United States at the time. The sentence made national headlines and sparked a fierce debate. Some viewed it as justice, others saw it as deeply troubling, especially given Paula's age, background, and emotional development. The international response came quickly. Human rights groups, legal advocates, and even Pope John Paul II appealed for clemency. A petition to spare Paula's life gained over 2 million signatures, many from outside the United States. Supporters didn't excuse the crime, but argued that sentencing a child to death, especially one with a documented history of abuse, was a step too far. They urged the courts to consider her capacity for change, especially given how young she was when the crime occurred. Over the next several years, Paula remained on death row. She spent most of her days in solitary confinement, reading books and studying law. She earned her GED and even began taking college-level courses. Prison staff noted her behavioral improvement and described her as respectful and motivated to change. Meanwhile, legal challenges continued behind the scenes. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned her death sentence, ruling that Paula's age at the time of the crime made the punishment unconstitutional under evolving standards. Her sentence was reduced to 60 years in prison, with the possibility of early release based on good behavior and time served. She was moved off death row and into a general population facility, where she continued her education and participated in outreach programs. One of the most remarkable chapters in Paula's story came years later, from an unexpected source. The grandson of the victim, Bill Pelkey, had initially supported the death sentence. But over time, he came to believe that forgiveness, not vengeance, was the better path. He visited Paula in prison. They spoke, face to face. He forgave her. And then he became one of her most vocal advocates, speaking publicly about restorative justice and the power of reconciliation. In 2013, after serving nearly 28 years behind bars, Paula Cooper was released on parole at age 43. Her release was quiet. She had plans to work, continue her education, and build a new life. Many who had followed her story were hopeful. But just 2 years later, in 2015, Paula was found dead in Indianapolis. She had taken her own life. The news was heartbreaking, not just for those who knew her, but for those who had fought for her second chance. It was a tragic end to a life that had been defined by pain, redemption, and the constant struggle for peace. The case of Paula Cooper still stands as a defining moment in the history of juvenile justice. It forced lawmakers, judges, and citizens to reconsider how society should treat young people who commit unthinkable acts. Should age offer a path to rehabilitation? Or are some crimes simply too severe for mercy? Today, Paula's story is used in classrooms, law schools, and criminal justice conferences across the country. It's a case that stirs strong emotions on all sides: grief for the life that was lost, sorrow for the child who took it, and an ongoing debate about what true justice looks like when a crime shatters more than one life. In the end, the story of Paula Cooper is not just about punishment. It's about transformation, forgiveness, and the fragile nature of second chances. It's a reminder that beneath every headline is a deeper story, one that challenges us to look not just at what happened, but why, and what can be done to keep it from happening again. In small towns, secrets rarely stay buried for long. But in the quiet village of Aberconfig, Wales, no one could have imagined that a 15-year-old boy was keeping one of the darkest secrets imaginable. Joshua Davies wasn't a name known for violence or trouble. He was intelligent, articulate, and even described as charming by some of his teachers. But behind the confident smile was a mind quietly obsessed with control, and a plan he would turn into a horrifying reality. The murder of his ex-girlfriend, Rebecca Aylward, wasn't a spontaneous act. It was calculated, cold, and most haunting of all, it was something he spoke about openly, before he ever carried it out. Joshua Davies and Rebecca Aylward had once been in a brief teenage relationship. It was typical of kids their age, emotional, intense, and short-lived. After they broke up, Rebecca tried to move on. But for Joshua, things took a different turn. According to those who knew him, he had a need to be in control, to be admired, and, in his own words, to be feared. He began telling friends about his fantasies of killing someone, specifically Rebecca. At first, most people didn't take him seriously. He was only 15. He was known to be dramatic. He made dark jokes and exaggerated stories. His peers thought it was just attention-seeking. But what they didn't realize was that Joshua was slowly building a plan, and he was testing how far he could go without being stopped. In messages, texts, and conversations, he would float the idea of killing Rebecca, sometimes even describing the method. Some friends laughed, others brushed it off. No one reported it, and that silence would come at a devastating cost. On October 23, 2010, Joshua invited Rebecca to meet him in the woods near his home. She had no reason to be afraid. Despite their breakup, he had been friendly recently. He said he wanted to talk, to catch up. Rebecca, who was just 15 herself, told her mother where she was going and left home that morning, unaware it would be the last time her family would ever see her. What happened in those woods was the culmination of weeks, maybe months, of planning. According to court testimony, Joshua struck Rebecca, using a large object to carry out the act. He then left her body in the undergrowth and returned home. But what followed was almost more chilling than the act itself. Joshua began texting and speaking to friends as if nothing had happened, even joking that he had done it. One friend, disturbed by what he heard, finally came forward. He told police what Joshua had said, and led them to the location in the woods. That's where officers found Rebecca's body. The village was stunned. For many, the idea that a local teenager could commit such a crime and brag about it was beyond belief. But the evidence was undeniable. Joshua had confessed to multiple people. His digital footprint showed he had talked about the plan in advance. And in a twist that shocked the court, it was revealed that one of his friends had jokingly offered to buy him breakfast if he went through with it. Joshua Davies was arrested and charged with murder. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered a chilling pattern. Joshua had researched poisonous plants. He had studied methods of causing harm, He had openly speculated about what it would feel like to kill someone, not in fear, but with fascination. At trial, his defense team argued that he was immature, not fully understanding the gravity of what he'd done. But prosecutors presented him as manipulative, strategic, and driven by ego. In court, the jury heard from friends who had been witnesses, not to the act itself, but to the warning signs, texts, conversations, jokes that now seemed like confessions. One friend even testified that he thought Joshua was trying to impress his peers by showing that he could do something shocking, something extreme. And tragically, no one stopped him. In July 2011, Joshua Davies was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years before he could apply for parole. He was just 16 at the time of sentencing. The judge called the crime brutal and callous and emphasized the element of premeditation. For Rebecca's family, it was a devastating loss. Their daughter had simply gone to meet someone she once trusted. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. The case sparked widespread conversation in the UK and beyond. It raised difficult questions about teenage violence, peer responsibility, and the influence of social dynamics. How could someone so young be capable of such detailed planning? Why didn't the people around him take the warnings more seriously? And what responsibility do we all share when someone jokes, even casually, about doing something dangerous? In the years since his conviction, Joshua Davies has remained incarcerated in the UK penal system. His case continues to be studied in academic and legal circles, not just because of his age, but because of the psychological factors involved. Experts have pointed to signs of narcissism, manipulation, and the desire for control. It was not a moment of rage. It was not a sudden loss of temper. It was a performance, one that cost an innocent girl her life. Today, the name Joshua Davies is remembered for all the wrong reasons. But for the family of Rebecca Aylward, the focus has never been on the perpetrator. It has always been about Rebecca, her smile, her kindness, and the future she never got to live. She was a beloved daughter, friend, and student whose life was taken far too soon. In the end, this case is a haunting reminder that teenage violence isn't always about impulse. Sometimes it's about the terrifying reality of what can happen when obsession, peer influence, and unchecked warning signs go too far, and when silence becomes the most dangerous response of all. Some crimes aren't driven by desperation or financial gain, but by the overwhelming pull of emotional attachment. In Derry, New Hampshire, a case involving a 16-year-old girl and her boyfriend revealed just how far misplaced love can go. Nicole Kasinskas wasn't known for breaking the rules. She was a quiet, intelligent student from a suburban neighborhood. But when her mother tried to keep her away from the person she cared most about, Nicole made a decision that would change everything. One that would leave a family shattered, a life lost, and two teenagers facing the rest of their lives in prison. Nicole grew up in what many would describe as a normal, middle-class household. Her mother, Teresa Kasinskas, was a hard-working nurse. She was strict, but not unreasonably so. Friends later described her as caring, protective, and devoted to her children. Nicole, however, had begun to struggle with her home life. As she entered her mid-teens, tensions grew, especially when she started dating 18-year-old Billy Sullivan, a boy her mother didn't approve of. Teresa believed the relationship was moving too fast. She worried that Billy was influencing her daughter in ways she didn't like. She reportedly tried to place limits on their time together, including restrictions on phone calls and visits. But Nicole resisted. What started as normal teenage defiance soon became a deep obsession. Nicole was convinced that she and Billy were meant to be together, no matter the cost. According to court documents, it was around this time that the couple began talking about a chilling idea. What if her mother was no longer in the way? It's unclear who first voiced the thought, but the conversation moved from vague complaints to a concrete plan. Text messages and recorded calls would later show that Nicole and Billy had discussed different ways to make it happen. Billy even purchased a gun, and Nicole provided details about her mother's routines and habits. On March 9, 2001, the plan was set in motion. Nicole's mother was home alone. Billy entered the house, and Nicole, according to prosecutors, was present during the crime or helped facilitate it immediately before and after. Teresa was found fatally shot in her own bedroom. Nicole then attempted to make the scene look like a robbery, but it wasn't long before investigators started asking questions. Police noted that the house showed signs of being staged. Nothing of real value had been taken. There were no signs of forced entry. And Nicole's story, that she had come home and found her mother already dead, began to fall apart under closer scrutiny. It was Billy who eventually cracked. He confessed to the shooting and implicated Nicole as a willing accomplice, not just in the planning, but in covering it up. The arrest of Nicole Kasinskas stunned the community. How could a teenage girl, someone with no prior criminal history, become involved in a plan to kill her own mother? The public was split. Some believed she had been manipulated by an older, more controlling boyfriend. Others believed she had played an equal role, that the crime was less about pressure and more about choice. Because of the seriousness of the charges, Nicole was tried as an adult. Prosecutors charged her with second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accomplice to murder. During the trial, her defense team argued that Nicole was vulnerable, emotionally immature, and under the influence of someone she believed she loved. They pointed to her age, just 16 at the time, and described her as impressionable and afraid. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of calculated betrayal, a plan carried out with full knowledge of its consequences, and a complete lack of remorse in the aftermath. In 2003, Nicole was found guilty and sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. Billy Sullivan, who had confessed to pulling the trigger, received a similar sentence. The courtroom was somber. Nicole showed little visible emotion as the sentence was read, while her remaining family members sat in stunned silence. The girl they once knew, a quiet honor student, was now heading to prison for decades. The case raised complex questions about teen psychology, influence, and accountability. How much control does a 16-year-old have over their choices when emotions are involved? Can love, or the idea of it, really override basic morality? And what happens when a teenager views a parent not as a protector, but as an obstacle? In the years since her conviction, Nicole Kasinskas has remained incarcerated in New Hampshire. Her name occasionally resurfaces in conversations about juvenile sentencing and extreme cases of familial violence. Supporters of youth rehabilitation argue that she should someday be given a chance at parole. Critics argue that the nature of the crime, the betrayal of one's own parent, should warrant a life behind bars. What makes Nicole's story so haunting isn't just the crime itself, but the contrast between who she appeared to be and what she ultimately did. There were no outward signs of danger, no history of violence, no long list of red flags. Just a teenage girl who fell in love, felt trapped, and made a choice that could never be undone. Teresa Kasinskas is remembered by friends and colleagues as compassionate, dedicated, and deeply committed to her family. Her loss was more than a news headline. It was a wound that still lingers in the community she served. For those who knew her, the heartbreak came not only from losing her, but from who took her away. Today, Nicole continues to serve her sentence. She'll be eligible for parole someday, though whether she's granted that freedom remains to be seen. Her story stands as a sobering example of what can happen when young emotions turn dangerous and when love becomes confused with control. It's a case that reminds us that not all tragedies happen suddenly. Some unfold slowly, one poor decision at a time, until the damage is irreversible. When a teenager from one of Los Angeles' wealthiest neighborhoods was arrested in connection with a fatal gang shooting, The headlines were immediate and explosive. His name was Cameron Terrell. He wasn't from South Central or East LA. He didn't grow up in a high-crime area or a broken home. He came from Palos Verdes, a quiet, upper-class coastal suburb with million-dollar homes, private schools, and carefully landscaped streets. So when news broke that this 18-year-old, a white teen from a privileged background, had allegedly been involved in a South Los Angeles gang murder, the public didn't know what to make of it. What followed wasn't just a criminal case. It became a national talking point, a case study in race, class, and how the justice system responds differently depending on where a defendant comes from. Cameron Terrell had just turned 18 in 2017 when he was arrested, but according to prosecutors, his involvement with a local gang had begun much earlier when he was still a minor. Friends and family described him as quiet, artistic, and even a bit of a loner. But at some point during his teenage years, Cameron developed a fascination with South LA gang culture, particularly with a set associated with the Rollin 90s neighborhood Crips. He began spending more time in neighborhoods far from Palos Verdes, eventually getting close to people affiliated with the gang. He even posted on social media about his associations and used gang-affiliated language. Prosecutors argued that despite his background, Cameron was more than just a curious outsider. They believed he had become an active participant in gang life. And in October 2017, they said, that involvement turned deadly. According to court documents, 2 young gang members were allegedly sent to carry out a shooting against a rival. Cameron was the one who drove them to the scene, and drove them away afterward. The target was 21-year-old Justin Holmes, who was walking through the Vermont Square neighborhood with 2 friends when he was confronted. Within seconds, a gun was fired. Holmes was struck and later died at the hospital. Police quickly connected the crime to local gang activity. Surveillance footage and witness statements led them to arrest 3 suspects, including the 2 alleged shooters and Cameron Terrell. The accusation was clear. While he didn't pull the trigger, he was the getaway driver. Under California law, that was enough to charge him with murder and attempted murder, under the theory of aiding and abetting. The news sent shockwaves through both the justice system and the media. Cameron's mugshot stood out. He didn't look like the others. He was white, well-dressed, the son of affluent parents. He had a spotless academic record and had attended an elite high school. His defense attorneys immediately emphasized these facts, arguing that Cameron was not a gang member, but a young man who had made bad choices and fallen in with the wrong crowd. But prosecutors painted a very different picture. They said Cameron had fully embraced gang culture, that he had joined willingly and had known exactly what was happening when he drove the car that day. They pointed to his social media activity, his familiarity with the gang structure, and even to phrases he had used in conversations after the murder. As the case moved to trial, public attention intensified. Many saw the case as a stark example of privilege in the legal system. Cameron was released on $5 million bail, a sum that most families could never dream of affording. He returned to school. In fact, during much of the trial process, he was attending classes at his high school as if nothing had happened. That contrast between a young man accused of murder and the ease with which he returned to normalcy didn't go unnoticed. In court, Cameron's legal team argued that he didn't know a shooting was going to happen, that he thought he was just giving friends a ride, that he didn't understand the full scope of the plan, and perhaps most critically, that he was not the one who fired the gun. The prosecution countered with evidence that he had participated in planning, had remained silent afterward, and had demonstrated loyalty to the gang. But in the end, the jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2018, Cameron Terrell was acquitted of all charges. The verdict stunned many and angered others. 2 of the other suspects, both black and from underprivileged backgrounds, continued to face serious charges. The contrast raised deep questions about how race and class affect perceptions of guilt, access to defense resources, and opportunities for rehabilitation. For Cameron, life after acquittal has remained largely private. He has not spoken publicly in detail about the case. No official statements have been released about whether he continues to associate with gang culture. And the family of the victim, Justin Holmes, has rarely addressed the outcome publicly, though supporters have expressed deep frustration with the verdict. What makes the case of Cameron Terrell so significant isn't just what happened, but what it revealed. It highlighted how different the criminal justice experience can be depending on your background, how money can buy better legal representation, secure bail, and shape the public narrative, and how, for some, even close proximity to a violent crime doesn't lead to the same consequences that others face. It also raises hard questions for young people navigating identity, loyalty, and influence. What compels someone with every opportunity in front of them to seek danger, rebellion, or belonging in places that carry real-life consequences? Is it thrill-seeking, a need for identity, or a deeper psychological desire to feel accepted, no matter the cost? The story of Cameron Terrell may not have ended in a conviction, but it left behind a lasting impact, not just for the family of the victim, but for a justice system still grappling with the difficult truth that sometimes equality in the courtroom exists more in theory than in practice. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next video drops. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and which case stuck with you the most. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.